themselves and introduce themselves. The point of this gathering is to for us to learn from these folks who have been doing very deep in this work for a very long time what they need from us as a medical community. We've already had conversations and I have some significant ideas about what they need, but I thought it would be best to hear it from them. A couple of little announcements. There is a sign-in computer on the desk out there. If you could sign in, that would be great, because then we'll know how many people came and who was interested, and your email addresses. These cards are Know Your Rights cards. Probably many of you have seen these. We have these to give out to you. Sarah Coleman is raising her hand. So if you want to get some of these and know how to order them if you don't know, she can give them to you and tell you that. The other thing that's on the computer that's really important, one of the things that we can do as a medical community is provide care to the folks that our attorney colleagues are trying to help. And on the computer sign up, there's a box where you can indicate whether you're interested in learning about doing pro bono care, because that is what this is going to have to be. And we're having conversations in the department and with Fairview and UMP, et cetera, about that. But I need to know who is a provider that would be interested in learning about doing pro bono care. It's not a commitment to that, but just so I can have some kind of list would be very helpful. So that's also on the sign up. So I'm going to turn this over. We've got about 15 minutes for each of these folks to tell us about themselves and what they need from us, and then go into a larger group discussion. Okay? So give this to you.
Great. Thank you.
There you
go. So first of all, thanks for coming. It's very much appreciated. It's always nice to see people who are interested and engaged, and who, you know, out of a sense of both perhaps a little bit of injustice, a little bit of compassion, all mixed in with just figuring out on what their role is. I really appreciate it, and I know other people in the community who do this work for a while appreciate it as well. And of course, I have to do a special shout out to the folks who helped guide me to this actual location as I gotten lost. So thank you. It is always kind of overwhelming a little bit to see the medical campus and having to find your way. But thanks everyone for coming. So what do? I teach at the University of Minnesota Law School. I'm a clinical teacher, which I think for many of you in the medical business, it's a little bit like residency. I have students that are that I supervise, and we use the old adage of learning is best when you're actually doing, and so I help supervise students as they represent people who are being held in ICE detention. So the vast majority, the entire majority of my clients are in fact detained by ICE either now or have just recently been released. So that's my entire clientele, are people who have been and are being detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Now, I've been doing this work for a while now, but a lot of what is happening now is, one of the common questions I get is, what's changed, right? People hear a lot about, wasn't Obama the deporter-in-chief, and wasn't immigration detention really exploded in 2005, and that's all true. But there is definitely a quality that is different under this administration, the choices that they're making on who they're detaining and what they're doing once they're detained, and how they are preventing people from being released has all changed, and the need is still growing. It was dire before, but it's become even more so now. So thank you very much. So from day one, if you do this work at all, which is working with people in removal proceedings generally, and then more specifically working with people who are detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, you see a lot of parallels with working in the criminal justice system. And one of the main things that you see, of course, is that unfortunately mental health, and I include both the, perhaps diagnosable issues, as well as just trauma, and of course, addiction are some very, very commonly seen issues that our clients are going through. Not every client, but I would say at least 75% of my clients have at least one of those three issues, right? Either dealing with trauma, either as young children or older, or dealing with a severe mental illness, and I include with that, either PTSD, or it could be some other of the psychotic illnesses that I've seen, or substance abuse, and of course, those can be all commingled, right? So there's a few things that I see as a lawyer, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more as a perspective of, as a lawyer, what is it that I would love to have on every case that I see that has any of those three issues, right? I don't think it's realistic, but I will just talk to you about what an ideal situation would be if I have a client that has any of these three issues. One, of course, I would want to figure out an idea of, well, what are the issues that the person has? What in terms of how trauma, whether they're, what kind of diagnosis. Sometimes I will get a stack of medical documents, right? I've had a client, one that Jerry helped work on with me, where the person had probably 20 years of medical documentation, and they were all, the vast majority of them were for emergency rooms, right? And I'm sure many of you know, emergency room diagnoses can go all over the place, and because this person would get help and care when a crisis hit. So I would have, 20 years worth of medical documentation, and I'm trying to figure out what all of that means. And I can't, right? I just don't know. I can flip through a DSM, but that doesn't really help anyone, right? So I would love to be able to have someone help me kind of figure out, well, what does this medical history mean, and what does it mean both in terms of what I can say about my client, in both the way I can interact with my client, right? I mean, I think this is really important. One of the big roles that we have as lawyers is that we need to counsel clients. We need to talk to them. We need to figure out how to interact with them. One of the first clients I had when I came to Minnesota, the first time I met him, it was in a context of I was providing free information and advice, and I was meeting him, and he started swearing at me from get-go and yelling at me and F you this, F you that, all of that kind of stuff, right? And he in fact became one of my favorite clients, right? Over the course of a few weeks and months, I had seen him every day going out to Ramsey County Jail and really gotten to know him, and I was able to build a relationship with him. Being a lawyer requires us to be able to build a relationship with our clients. And sometimes that means understanding whatever mental health issues that they might be facing. Obviously, as a human being, we have a certain level of understanding, but a health professional is really helpful. So that's on one side. It's just the relationship between me and the client. I need to know more, right? It could be I need sometimes an explanation of, well, what does it mean that this person was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder and PTSD as axis 1 or 2, and what does that mean? Like how am I supposed to take that as information that I might or might not be able to use? On the other hand, like, what's the best way for me to talk to someone? This person can present as being extremely paranoid. How do I develop trust with that person, right? These are things that I am not trained, and I would love to get more help and understanding on how to do that. I've gone through a few CLEs that are designed for lawyers on that, but I know things are change, and just a little knowledge can be dangerous. So I'd love to be able to understand some of those types of interactions and how best to do that, while also understanding that my role is not to provide therapy, right? That when I'm meeting with a client and trying to gain information, I think that's one thing that comes up is because we tend to do this work as an empathetic person, we tend to try to play a role that we're not necessarily equipped to do, right? And so that's something that we also, in my mind, it's something that I need to be reminded sometimes when I'm doing an information interview or I'm doing an interview with a client. Yes, I want to build rapport. Yes, I want to understand what's happening with them. But no, I am not a mental health professional and I am not there to provide therapy. So that is one thing that, I think is a need that's there with a lot of times with our client. The second, of course, is what to do with explaining things to a judge. Now, in immigration law, generally, and this is not unique to immigration law, there are several different ways that mental health issues, such as trauma, such as severe mental illness, and such as addiction, can impact your case, right? We all know that there are, of course, stereotypes and misconceptions that the public have, and guess what? Judges have them as well, right? So one of the big issues will be is how do I make sure the judge understands that just because someone might have been diagnosed with schizophrenia doesn't mean that they're dangerous? How can I make sure the judge understands that just because someone has had 4 different stints at trying to recovery, that doesn't mean that they are a lost cause and they can't recover, right? So there's that part of it. And then there is, what do I need to make sure I can make my case? And there are some key points here that's important. One is dangerousness. A lot of the times an immigration judge has to judge whether your client is dangerous. That can impact whether the person gets released on bond. That can impact whether the person might be eligible for a form of relief. That can really impact the entire case. Is the person dangerous? And then the second part, and this is something that I've had some discussion with Dr. Kroll about, and I think it's really difficult to navigate, which is rehabilitation. What does it mean to be rehabilitated? Now, many of my clients have had some contact with the criminal justice system, which means they've had some convictions, which means that we have to have a conversation about, is that person sorry? How does the judge know they won't commit the crimes again? Well, this is where some role of a mental health professional can help. Obviously, the understanding of that, no judge is going to go ahead and say, okay, Dr. So-and-so, you tell me this person is rehabilitated, I'll take your word for it. Or you tell me this person is not dangerous, I'll take your word for it. They still view their role as making that judgment. But a mental health professional can really help explain lots of things. Like, this person was triggered because of X, Y, and Z. I just had a case, which we won a very difficult case, but I had an expert explain, and Jerry also helped work on this case, help explain some of their criminal history and why someone with PTSD might be triggered in doing certain things and how that does so. That helps explain our narrative that we are trying to put across. And then finally, I think one of the biggest roles is we need help with figuring out what to do with a client once they are released. Many people need support and services. We tried for a while. We had a program with the social work school about trying to find some student social workers to kind of help provide some case management. I think it's going to be challenging on that regard, but it is something that we would love help with, like housing issues, increased treatment, medication compliance. All of those things are things that we want to play a role, and that's something else that I would really love to hear from you guys is, what is our role, right? We have a client, we care about that client usually, we work really hard to get this client this relief, and it will mean nothing if their life continues to fall apart, right? So what is our best way of trying to make sure that support is there? Now, there are several different ways that an involvement can be. As I said, one is just help us understand, educate us on ways that we can provide this information to the court and the judge. The second way is have people do actual evaluations of our client. And that will be providing reports and, in some cases, actual testimony in front of the judge. It's great to provide a written report. It's absolutely wonderful. It's really key. But lots of judges don't read material that we submit. They will be forced to listen if you're in court. So that's something else we need. It's a challenge because our people are being detained sometimes hours away. Sherburne is the largest one. It's 40 minutes away. So these are all different ways I think that we can need help and provide it, and I've run out of time, I'm sure. So I'm happy to answer any other questions that people have.
No pressure.
Yeah, we also like paragraphs.
Should I go? Do we want to go in order? Okay, order's good. Boy, girl, boy, girl. Boy, girl, boy, okay. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. My name is Katrina Cisneros, and I am a licensed independent clinical social worker. And I just want to say thank you for the invitation to be here. I was really excited to come. I have never been in this building, and I don't know anybody else on the panel, and which I also think it speaks volumes to the work that we have to do, and the possibilities that might come out of an event like this. So I am currently full-time faculty at the School of Social Work here at the University of Minnesota, where I teach across the lifespan of our graduate program. But before becoming what's maybe considered an academic, I'm really a social work practitioner. I have been for 20 years. My grounding is sort of in public child welfare, but my heart and the majority of my work in the field has been in the nonprofit sector, doing clinical mental health, both outpatient and in-home, and working with chronically stressed, which I think the term used to be dysfunctional. We don't use that term anymore. Chronically stressed family systems and individuals. And most of my work here in the Twin Cities has been in the Latino community doing program development around mental health, and providing service, both to children, adolescents, and to families. So, my most recent work in connection to some of this, so I would say for most of my mental health practice here within the United States, I have sat in many, many sessions with many, many people who are at some point in this journey, right? Either they have just gotten to the United States, maybe documented, maybe undocumented, are potentially involved in some sort of a court proceeding or process, or who have made it through to the other side of that and are trying to establish some sort of life for themselves and for their family. And so a lot of my work around that, there has been some intersection with legal in terms of writing some of those letters and doing some of that kind of behind the scenes work to support clients around their mental health and around their immigration. Most recently, my connection to this work has been providing trauma-informed mental health care to refugees in the shelters on the Mexican side of our border. So what many people don't know is that under the current administration, there has been a policy change in which people who are seeking asylum can no longer do so in the manner that they used to, and are now, when arriving to the border, being told that they need to wait to ask for asylum in Mexico. Just to be clear, these are cities that myself as a U.S. citizen is advised not to go to. So most of my work has been in Tijuana. I've gone down now for 2 rounds of clinic to provide trauma-informed mental health care down there, and I'm working pretty diligently with local psychologists and mental health providers on the ground that have sort of initiated a lot of this work. Every day in Tijuana, there are shelters opening and closing. And when I say a shelter, I'm talking about the back of the church opening up where people are able to put tents, or some ground opening up in a public space where people are able to kind of, lay their head down for some time. So I think that the work that's happening down at the border that I'm involved in is an absolute beautiful depiction of what I think we also want to create here in the Twin Cities. And I want to say to you, let's keep thinking, let's keep dreaming big. Let's not let go of that because I want to help. And even as you're talking, I'm thinking about the clients that I work with and how I could leverage your expertise. And then as I'm hearing you, I'm thinking, oh, that might be something that I could do for you. So I just think that the model of care, I think especially when we're talking about refugees down at the border, has to be congruent with the culture and the experience that one has around some of these issues. And so a lot of the work that we do down there is actually kind of a triad of expertise. So there's a medical team of volunteer doctors and nurses. There's mental health, which the last round of clinic was myself and one psychologist from Wisconsin who flew down. And then we also have an agency called Al Otro Lado and Border Rights that provides pro bono legal consult to people staying in the shelters. And so when we kind of roll up to a shelter on the Mexican side of the border, it's a really powerful kind of integration of services because, and I can give you an example. So when I went down the first time to the shelters, I was running women's support groups. And there was one woman in particular that I was pretty concerned about in terms of her mental health. Had I been able to stay down there, I probably would have done some continuity of care and would have probably wanted to see her at least once or twice a week with her baby. And when I went down the second time, I had an opportunity to see her again. And she looked better, and part of that was because she had now an immigration date to come to the U.S. to ask for asylum. Did my mic go out? No. But she said, you know, as she was crying, she said, the problem is I haven't even spoken to an attorney. And that's one of the things I don't think people really realize that's happening down in the border. Under this return to Mexico policy, people are just given a handout of resources around legal consult or legal advice or legal support. But then when you're in a shelter in Tijuana, you don't have access to legal. And so these attorneys that I've had the privilege to meet down there who sort of go down for a month and walk with medical teams and walk with our mental health team just to sort of be able to sit down and let people know, okay, these are the things you might want to think about when you're preparing for this interview. The process for getting an interview down at the border right now is super chaotic, and it's just, when I first heard about it, I had to go down there to observe it to even believe it, because what happens is when you return back to Mexico to wait for asylum, you're basically given a number, which is a number that was just, it's literally pulled from a spiral notebook. One number is given the same number is given to 10 different people. And every day at the border down in Tijuana, a group of people who are actually also asylum seekers are organizing people that are waiting to request asylum. And so every morning, the U.S. kind of communicates across the border of how many people they're allowing over that day to seek asylum. And then based on that number, this kind of Mexican group of people trying to organize people waiting at the shelters names off which numbers are able to cross that day. The problem with that is that the wait for your number to be called is now almost, it can be up to a half a year out. The average allowance to stay at a shelter is 8 weeks. So you have families, mostly women and children, moving from shelter to shelter, trying to find a safe place to be. Also remembering that the reason you're seeking asylum is because you're fearing for your life or you're under some sort of persecution. So you have large groups of mostly women and children who are not safe, who are sort of trying to find some sort of stability. They can't return back to their country of origin, and they're waiting for this system in which this number that was pulled out of a spiral notebook is going to be called so that they can get in a van and cross to request asylum. So the process in and of itself is it's chaotic and it's uncertain, which also impacts people's mental health. The majority of people that I work with down there are women and children, all of whom are seeking asylum, all of whom have traveled thousands of miles only to get to the border to be told that they have to wait. And so the model of care down there, which I think would be an interesting model for us to kind of conceptualize locally, is that the medical team, the legal team, and the mental health team arrive together. We set up clinic where people can receive free medical care. Now, there are a lot of doctors. My last trip down at clinic just a couple of weeks ago, I think that there were probably 18 medical providers, but the need and the shortage of mental health providers is really pervasive. And part of that, I think, is because there is an emphasis and a huge need, especially in the shelter model, for people's medical care. And it can be anything from, getting kiddos antibiotics to doing lab testing to, making sure people are, have access to their antidepressants to making sure that people have access to their hormone replacement shots. So what the medical team provides down there is pretty varied. And the pharmacy is basically 20 Ziploc bags of donated medication that we throw out on a folding table. And then we have an intake process. One of the things that Abigail Hitchen and I are working on, she's the mental health kind of lead down there and trying to be sort of a gatekeeper, because you have a lot of people that want to help down at the border, and even here locally, but you have to be really conscientious of how you do that so that it is not a repetition of an oppressive system. Also recognizing power and privilege and what it means to intersect with who you are, with who you're serving. And I think that, that there is, it's fertile ground for this sort of white savior complex, right? Of like, we're going to go down and we're going to help without really having an understanding of what it means to help or what's even needed. So I think that the work at the border and here locally really needs to start from an anti-oppressive place and also a place of humility, of cultural humility, of social humility. So that the work in and of itself is trauma informed and we're not in some ways, what I think is helping is actually hurting. So, but it's sort of a nice process. One of the things that we're thinking of, because culturally, especially for a lot of our Latino refugees, they experience mental health as a physical experience. And so a lot of times people will come wanting to see a doctor because they think they're having a heart attack or because they have a lot of muscular pain or they're having a lot of headaches, when really, if we can get a mental health person to help partner on that intake, what we're seeing is panic, what we're seeing is PTSD, what we're seeing is depression. It's just manifesting somatically. And so then we can leverage resources and be more efficient so that someone who actually needs to see the doctor can see the doctor, and maybe someone who needs an individual mental health consult or psychoeducation can get that rather than having to cross-pollinate services. And then, so that woman that I talked with who, with baby in arms is saying, I have my immigration interview on the 1st of August, but I haven't even spoken with an attorney. I can go right over to Border Rights, who's sitting at that chair, and say, would you mind coming and talking to her so that, she can at least, make an appointment. The clinic that I work out of in Tijuana so it's a medical clinic. There's a food kitchen, Food Not Bombs, and then there's a legal clinic as well up on the 3rd floor. So it's kind of, and that clinic has seen over 5,000 patient consults since November. Because you have to remember, this shelter crisis in Tijuana is new. This has all been born out of this man-made humanitarian crisis at our border. This is a man-made humanitarian crisis. So anyway, so that's a little bit about that. Locally, so the mental health team that was sort of formed here in the Twin Cities, we're now calling ourselves the REACH Project, the Refugee Empowerment and Community Health Project. We're actually looking to organize local licensed mental health professionals to be able to go down on another trip to Tijuana, potentially in January. We're kind of looking at that. I would like to show up to the clinic, and when we break up into teams, have as many mental health professionals as there are doctors. I would love every team that goes out to the shelters to have a mental health component to it. When you talk, our work all intersects. Attorneys need evaluations and mental health expertise. I need legal because I need to know the logistics of how I can best support this person. And then if a person's not well, they can't do anything. So we need to have comprehensive medical care. So those three pieces together are a pretty powerful trifecta. And I think it's also aligned with what the need is. We're seeing and we're treating and we're honoring the whole person and not trying to compartmentalize who they are into different parts like our system already does. We're saying, no, you get to be all of who you are, and we see all of who you are, and we're going to make sure all of who you are is okay. So anyway, I think, so locally, that's something that's happening. Also, I just want to recognize Dr. Fuel, who's here, and you want to raise your hand. Amazing activist and actually the pioneer of the trips down to Tijuana in terms of the medical component. And, you know, one of the things that now we're talking about locally is there's a lot of fear within the community about deportation, about immigration proceedings, about what's going to happen. And so even just looking locally at how can we look at what's already being done and support the mental health and medical needs of people who are afraid and who don't know what to do. So the Know Your Rights legal piece is really important. I think that that information has been really well disseminated and continues to be. When you think about what it means for a kid who's at school wondering if when they get off the bus their parents are going to be there, that's a whole other level of care and concern that needs to also be identified and addressed. And so we're really looking and thinking creatively about how do we leverage people that are already in people's lives and communities. You know, Dr. Fuel has talked a lot about, and we're considering sort of how do we leverage some of the church communities where people are already sort of identifying this is a safe place for me to be in order to run some mental health groups or some medical, you know, trying to figure out a way to kind of reach out to local communities who are saying, you know, we could use some support here, whether that's legal or medical or mental health. But I also, I really appreciate what you said about, you know, everybody needs to work within their area of competency. It's one of like the ethical pieces, I think, of anything that I do as a social worker or a doctor or an attorney. It's like you have to know what your role is. And so I think some of those connections where we could easily be able to leverage expertise easily and quickly and efficiently, because right now that the ownership of that is put on the client, and that in of itself is exhausting. If you don't even have the energy you don't even know how you're going to get up and be a mom or, you know, even just get through the day, the thought of having to contact all of these people and coordinate your own care is extremely overwhelming. So I would love to see some sort of a wraparound model, to use kind of a social work term, where there's some sort of continuity of care. And that's something we're struggling with right now at the border. I have a conference call on Friday morning with local providers down there because we're trying to do program development, because you have medical and mental health providers that go down there, but then we all leave. So what happens to the woman who was feeling like she didn't want to live anymore? And she doesn't know where she's going to get her next meal. She's got to be out of this shelter in 5 days. What happens to her? We cross the border. We get on our planes, right? And then a lot of, you know, people, they feel really good about themselves. But what about her? Who's going to follow up with her? Who's making sure that the next week someone's checking in on her? Who's following where she's going? Who's making sure that the baby's okay? So I think that's one of the things we're looking at in terms of continuity of care. And I think it would also be a local need. Like you're saying, how do we not just start something, but how do we know how to finish it? People are tired of someone starting something, right? Everyone's a good starter. We need finishers. We need people that are going to stay in it and stay connected. Because that in and of itself is trauma-informed care, and that's ethical care. So, so I think that's it. I will just stop there. Thank you for your time.
That was perfect.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So I will put another plug in for you to sign into the computer on the table in the back, because there's going to be follow-up for all of these great things that are being said to us, which is exactly the point of being here. So we know what to do. But we'll be wrapping this up and bringing this to some action points sometime in the next few weeks, but I need to know who to include. So I'll put another plug in for you to sign up in the back.
Can I just say one more thing? Because I see some of my students here from graduate school, and I just want to shout all of you out because I just love all of you. And I just want to also say that at the School of Social Work, I'm actually developing a course to take clinical trainees down to the border. So if you're one of the people in the program and that might be of interest to you in the School of Social Work, hit me up.
Okay. Dr. Kroll?
Thank you. If you can't hear me in the back, please let me know, because it seems to me like I'm shouting, but it's not always that way. Thank you for organizing the conference, Steve. As you guys were talking, I just want to comment briefly on two symmetries. Linus is a lawyer and is trying to avoid doing mental health care, but ends up doing it. And I'm a psychiatrist, and I try to avoid giving legal advice, but I suspect I end up doing it, with the caveat that, I'm not a lawyer, but. Right. So each of us cross over into the other domain. The other is you're working with people who are trying to get in, and I'm often working with people who are trying to stay in and not be put out. Yeah. So there are just certain symmetries that strike me. I can only present a psychiatric point of view from the state side, not from working down there. What can a psychiatrist do and not do? I think you had a good idea from Linus as to what the lawyer wants and how can we do this. I want to mention certain difficulties, pitfalls, and not getting discouraged. The prison system is not built for our comfort, and the only way you can stay in is to realize that the prisoners have it worse than we do. So they can't get out. We can get out, but getting there and finding that the sergeant in charge doesn't let you in, or the papers aren't correct, or you're not wearing the right kind of clothing. I was traveling the other week down by Fort Dix in the boonies because they didn't have the right color trousers on. It was my fault because the prisoners wore khaki, and I was wearing khaki, and they won't let you in with khaki. But there's no clothing stores out in the middle of New Jersey. I ended up first buying some shorts, and I thought they'll never let me in with that. Then I ended up buying athletic, like running pants. So it just was a difficult 4 or 5 hours waiting around. Then they finally let you in, and then you sit and wait again. So one has to have some forbearance as to what you'll put up with. And I find it easiest, and I don't mean false humility. Well, I have no basis complaining. I can still get in, I can get out. This poor guy, I'm going to see, he's stuck there. And so don't complain. I think it's our job, and it dovetails with what you're saying. We have to present the psychiatry viewpoint. If done best, has to present the person, the prisoner, as an individual, to the extent that the judge is likely to look at all prisoners, all asylees are alike, all detainees, all deportees are alike, that they're just people telling stories, wanting to stay here. What is it you want that I'm not going to give you, or maybe give you? But people get grouped into larger categories, usually unfortunate categories. And I think that it's our job, to a large extent, to do a narrative description that makes the judge see this person as an individual. In order to do that, you have to do enough interviewing with the person and enough time, which is not always easy, to see the individuality of this person and then paint that verbal portrait in your letter, testimony, if it comes to that. So I say he because there must be some, but I've not seen any women detainees. To have them see this person as an individual with his own life dreams, aspirations, difficulties, traumas, mistakes, yet deserving the opportunity to stay here and not be, what is the term again? Removed. Removal is such a terrible term. And I think it's up to our skills as psychiatrists not to just play a numbers game or a diagnostic game. I'll get to that in a minute. But to go back to some old interviewing skills, and one blushes to say psychodynamic anymore, but certainly psychodynamic approach to seeing the person, as I say, as an individual, because I think that's the only chance they have, that this is a person, not just a number, not just a pain in the ass, not just one more person we have to pass through in the next, in the next 10 minutes or the next hour. I have made a mistake on the other end of things, which in one of my letters I recommended that the person be allowed to stay. And I just had a terrible thumping by the judge. Unfortunately, I gave it back, but I don't think that I don't think that helped, in which I recommended the person stay, and the judge said, "Why did you recommend that?" I say, "Well, that was my opinion. I'm supposed to write my medical opinion." He said, "Well, that's my job, not your job, and that tells me you are biased, and therefore I can't trust anything you say." Not kind words. And so we had a bad session, I think. But I have to remember, it's not about me. It's about, in this case, it was a lady. It's not under detention, but under threat of deportation. So it really was not about me, but the judge kind of made it. I mean, I made the mistake of thinking the judge and I were colleagues. She's professional in her way. I'm professional in my way. We can even sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk about this, but that wasn't the case. It was her domain, her territory. She's the boss. And so just for those who have to do that, you have to keep in mind whose house you're sitting in when you're doing this. I'm not sure what else I can tell you. I made some notes, but one has to try and also present an ethical picture within the letter itself, within the interview, without getting moralistic, without offending the judge, but somehow inserting into it some notion that the ethical thing to do is to understand this person as the individual and not send the person away. The arguments we give, I'm surprised they work sometimes. They say, well, they won't be able to get their HALDO in another country, or they won't be able to get the, it seems to me sometimes it's the least of it, but it seems to work. So I say, if you send this person back to XYZ, they won't be able to get treatment. Well, I say the HALDO and the meds are the least of it. They may get killed. They won't worry about the HALDO. But I think the law perceives the person with an illness, any kind, as requiring special protection. And that argument may be effective in helping the person not get deported. So we make the argument. But I think the other argument I keep going back to is this is an individual suffering, and we know you're not going to let everyone in or everyone stay, but here's this person in front of us, so we're going to work for that person. By the way, my notion of when things changed was not just the present administration, but I think the whole immigration picture changed with 9/11. And I had gone around the country giving talks for USCIS, citizenship and immigration, trying to explain to the judges, not the judges, the officers. I call them adjudicators. What schizophrenia is, what depression is, what trauma is. And it seemed to me a clear difference between the people who worked for Department for Citizenship prior to 9/11, when citizenship was under Department of Justice, which I thought then was kind of gentler than it is now. But citizenship was turned over to Homeland Security, and the type of person they were hiring at that point would no longer, I'll use that terrible phrase from the East Coast, bleeding heart social workers, which is okay.
Oh boy.
No.
Just kidding.
What I'm saying is what they started getting was a group of law and order people. Yeah. So, we know what you want, we're not going to give it to you, as opposed to how can I help you? Yeah. And so I think that made really all of the work much more difficult. And I think it happened when citizenship was transferred into Homeland Security, and the whole notion was immigrants are security risks, as opposed to before 9/11, immigrants are welcome in because this is what America does, and they have something to offer in addition. I think the practicality of finding psychiatrists who were willing to go up to Sherman County, the furthest Fort Dix was an aberration, despite the fact that I come from New Jersey. But my accent is not New Jersey. And there was one down by Austin, Minnesota. And, when doing it, you're giving up a half day, a day, and that's okay. But I say when you keep in perspective is what it is that you're working on or what other people are at risk of losing. So there are practical issues with finding psychiatrists. I think if the workplace situation was, I can't say more cooperative, just would cooperate and give release time or that kind of stuff, figure it out how to cover for the person, that might help. Otherwise, I would urge psychiatrists to get involved. This is kind of the minimal level without going down to these other places. It's very rewarding work. It's professionally exciting, and without being a trauma voyeur, there's good work to be done at an ethical level. So I will end with this. We can have discussion later on.
Very much. I find myself hanging on your every word just like I did 25 years ago. Many of us had our training contributed to by Dr. Kroll. Anyway, it is part of the goal of this gathering to increase the number of psychiatrists and psychologists and LMFTs and social workers, bleeding heart or otherwise.
We'll take you.
To do this work. And so I will be circling back to you probably for some trainings on this, and especially how to write the reports in the way that you indicated that we might want to be careful of. Alison?
Hi, so how many folks in the audience are social workers? Could you raise your hand? Okay, wonderful. And how many are psychologists or other mental health professionals? Great, okay, woohoo. And how many are MDs, medical doctors? All right, so there are opportunities for everyone who raised their hand, and when Dee invited me to be part of this panel, it was my dream opportunity because I work with asylum seekers, thousands of children and families and detainees and torture survivors throughout Minnesota and the Dakotas who lack access to the care that they need and to the evaluations that they need to prove their cases before immigration courts and asylum offices. So I'm an attorney at the Advocates for Human Rights. We support volunteer attorneys in representing asylum seekers. Our clients are children. There are hundreds of unaccompanied children, and as well as children who are seeking asylum as part of family units in Minnesota. The last time I looked at the numbers, there were 2,000 juveniles who were unrepresented before the immigration court just here in Minnesota. So many of those are kids who have to present their case in an adversarial setting alone. So we try to connect those children and families, detainees, and torture survivors with attorneys. We work with a lot of families who were released from the border. I was in Dilley, Texas a couple weeks ago, and they were filling up the detention center where more than 1,000 families can stay with people who were receiving credible fear and reasonable fear interviews, and because they were mothers with children, would have to be released from detention. And then they're also just given a list of service providers and said, good luck, and have to find an attorney to make these challenging claims before local immigration courts all over the country, and have a 0.5% chance of success without representation by an attorney, and often really need evaluations. These are trauma survivors, many individuals who have PTSD, many individuals who are suffering from depression. Again, we work with individuals who are torture survivors, many of whom were tortured in detention, and then are again detained when they get to the United States and very re-traumatized by the experience of being detained. Here in Minnesota, we have a lot of initial asylum seekers in our detention centers because we have bed space. People are transferred up from the border. People are apprehended at our airport, at our MSP airport when they're coming to the United States, and put in detention to seek protection. And then there's also people who have asylum type relief available who are apprehended after living in the United States, sometimes for many years. So how do asylum seekers get to Minnesota? In many ways, in short. And there are 11,000 pending cases just before our local immigration court for 4 judges to decide. So many of those are asylum cases. And so you can see the need here, right in our community, is enormous, and we really need you to help. Asylum seekers have a complicated claim for relief that they have to present before the court. It's not just, so this was part of our work in detention centers, and then also is part of our work with our clients. It's not enough just to show that your family's life is in danger. You have to prove to the court that you have suffered serious harm and have to describe that harm in detail to an adjudicator, often in an adversarial setting, and show that the harm that you suffered is connected to some personal characteristic that you can't change or shouldn't have to change, like your orientation, your family relationship, your gender, or something else about you that made the person or people who harmed you want to do so. You also have to explain why your government can't protect you, which can be a really challenging burden on the person before the court who just knows that the police didn't protect them and often isn't sure why they weren't able to do so. You also have to show that there's no part in your country that you could go to where you'd be safe, and that you have the same fear in the future when the hearing might happen 5 years after you initially filed your application, during which time you might be separated from family. So this has always been a challenging process, but right now it's particularly challenging. As you have heard, the challenges to the rights of asylum seekers have been near constant. Just this week, just this Monday, there were 3 new policies that will severely restrict the rights of asylum seekers. One was one of many recent Attorney General decisions where the AG sought to restrict the protections available to asylum seekers that have existed since the 1980s. The Attorney General said that a whole category of people who are harmed because of their family relationship shouldn't receive asylum. So, of course, as attorneys, we'll be fighting that decision on every level, and we'll be fighting for our clients to receive the protection they deserve. But that puts so many families at risk who have been recognized as clearly eligible for protection since the 1980s. Another extremely concerning recent change that impacts all of your clients and people that you serve, if you serve immigrant community members, is the massive expansion of expedited removal. From previously, expedited removal was a process that could be used within 100 miles of the border, and now, since last week, has been expanded to the entire interior of the United States. So if you work with someone who an ICE agent thinks could be an immigrant and can't prove that they have been in the United States for more than 2 years, and can't prove that they have legal status, then that person could be subjected to immediate removal by that ICE officer without the chance to go see an immigration judge, without the chance to plead their case, typically without access to counsel in that encounter. So we are very concerned that this new policy will result in profiling of immigrant communities, will result in people who are very vulnerable, so people with severe mental health issues in particular, who may not be able to carry proof of their legal status or their time in the United States on them, will become more vulnerable. So this is a real need for us to be in coordination, and we really want to hear from you if your clients are being impacted by these new policies, so that as attorney community we can respond. We're also seeing huge pressure on the immigration courts for those people who are able to be before the court. The immigration judges are required to decide 700 cases per year to get a satisfactory performance review as of this year. So immigration judges have described their cases as death penalty cases in a traffic court setting. So these are cases where someone's life is literally on the line, and the judge has a very limited time to review the record and very limited information potentially. So the evaluations that mental health professionals can do are often essential for the immigration judge to understand that individual's case. And so I want to get into a little bit about why evaluations are so important. The credibility standards that asylum seekers are required to meet, I have been told by mental health professionals, are very much not consistent with how memory works and how people actually recall their experiences. But the judges are supposed to consider someone's demeanor, which is a very subjective analysis. So it's maybe a Western male individual who's interviewing a woman who survived rape and domestic violence and is looking down and not making eye contact with the judge. That demeanor can come into play in the assessment of her credibility. Candor, responsiveness, according to the judge, the inherent plausibility, which isn't subjective at all, and the consistency between written and oral statements that the asylum seeker may previously have made, including statements that were made to Border Patrol upon first entering the United States and made to a uniformed officer while detained, potentially at 2 a.m., potentially with a crying baby in someone's arms. So these are all things that the judge considers in assessing if the person before them is credible. And oftentimes, asylum seekers are in removal proceedings before the court because they weren't able to gather a bunch of documents and prepare their case. I mean, asylum seekers are fleeing for their life, right? So they don't have a suitcase of documents to prove their case. So oftentimes, the mental health evaluation is one of the most important ways that the judge can understand, okay, this person isn't presenting as someone I might perceive as credible. What could be impacting them? Is there trauma that's happening here? Why are they having a flat affect, for example, when they're talking about these horrible things they're describing to me, when I might expect them to be crying? How does that relate to how they're experiencing trauma? Why are they seeming to not answer my questions and disassociating from this courtroom and not able to participate in their proceeding? All of these things are things that could be just seen as an aberration and not credible because if the judge doesn't have an evaluation that explains why these things are happening. So I just want to share briefly a few examples of what mental health professionals have meant to my clients when we've had them involved. In one case, there was a child who was applying for asylum with her mother, and the child's testimony happened to be essential to the case for protection for the family. When I first met the child, she couldn't even say her name to the immigration judge without crying because she was so traumatized by the violence she had experienced in her home country and by her experience of the court system there. She was able to connect with a therapist who she had a really great relationship with and get 9 months of therapy. And when I saw her as she was preparing for the final hearing, she was able to meet with me and create a declaration about her experiences. She was able to testify in court, and she was able to crack jokes, which I had never expected to hear a joke from this kid who was so traumatized when I first met her. So that therapy was absolutely essential. Last week, I was in an asylum interview with an individual who had been repeatedly tortured in detention, and his therapist was able to be in the interview with us. So as he was having to tell his story to the officer and was having difficulty regulating himself and his voice and how he was telling the story, then the psychologist could stop him and say, okay, let's take a break, let's stand up, let's move, help reorient him to the place where he was telling his story. And that really helped the officer be able to understand what he had experienced and also help him stay in the moment and tell his story. And I had another child who was a survivor of sexual violence who was an unaccompanied minor, so she had to tell her story alone to the officer. And she was not opening up. We were working with her for months, but she was not able to feel comfortable sharing that story. It was really taking her a while to feel comfortable, even with her attorneys. Finally, we were able to break through shortly before her interview, but the evaluation really helped because the way she told her story was very reserved, very quiet. She wouldn't give details. She was angry about it rather than teary-eyed or sad about it. That was how her trauma manifested. And so the evaluation that we were able to provide to the officer was essential in them understanding, okay, this is how in her particular case trauma is manifesting, and it doesn't mean that you should find her not credible. So as I've described, there are extremely long delays for asylum interviews, often years after an initial application is filed, and immigration court hearings happen even years after that. Asylum seekers are not permitted to work they're not even permitted to apply for work permits until 6 months after their initial application is filed, which if they're looking for an attorney and trying to figure out how to file an application not in their first language, that has a lot of complicated questions in it about their reasons for coming to the United States, might be much longer than 6 months after they first reach Minnesota. So asylum seekers are often struggling with homelessness or near homelessness, struggling with food. How are they going to feed their families? How are they going to get through the day? And so it can be really hard to focus on filing a complex legal application when those immediate needs aren't met. So another major need that we have is for pro bono therapists. We do have a short list of pro bono therapists that we share with attorneys, but obviously those 5 people on that list can't do all of the pro bono therapy that's needed. Asylum seekers do qualify for insurance after their work permit is filed, so it wouldn't be a forever pro bono relationship. There is a possibility of insurance down the road, but for that first period, that essential period before the application is filed, there is no access to insurance whatsoever. And we really need social workers and non-psychiatrists and psychologists to write letters of support to the asylum office. The asylum office finds that kind of documentation really valuable and finds your recommendations. For example, Dr. Kroll mentioned that if you can explain how the how the client might, how their mental health might be impacted by a return to their home country, you're not saying what your opinion is about whether they should go back, but you are saying, in your professional opinion, how their mental health could be impacted. That can be really key sometimes to us proving cases for our clients. And then also, we really need psychologists and psychiatrists to provide forensic evaluations in immigration court. And as Linus said, testimony is often essential for the judge to understand and get the chance to ask you questions. And we're really lucky in that we have mentors who are trained forensic psychologists. Adnan, do you mind raising your hand? Adnan is one of our wonderful mentors and recently trained up some psychologists so they're ready to go with these evaluations. And as Jerry mentioned, it can be intimidating to be in immigration court, so we're really happy that we can connect you with these mentors who can help you get comfortable with the idea of experiencing immigration court, ask your questions, know what to bring with you, just all the logistics of how this service works. And another really, really important need that I want to highlight is evaluations for detainees. Like Dr. Kroll said, there are detention centers where we have asylum seekers long-term detained. One of our clients more than 2 years in detention, and that's not even that abnormal. So we really, really need people who are providing these services in the detention centers that surround the Twin Cities metro area. So we want to expand our list of pro bono therapists who can help people during the process, particularly anyone who speaks a second language. But even if you don't, we're recruiting volunteer interpreters. And we really want to get on your schedule our upcoming October 4th. Please mark your calendars. The Advocates for Human Rights, in collaboration with the University of St. Thomas School of Law, is offering a full-day training for mental health providers and attorneys on evaluations for asylum seekers, on considerations in working with immigrant communities who are impacted by the changes in policy. So this will be a great event. We'll have continuing education credits. We really want to see you there because that's a great next step to get trained up and ready to take these evaluations on. So thank you so much for making us all feel hopeful that our clients, when they're facing so many challenges and so much terrifying policy changes and terrifying rhetoric, that there are people who want to help, and there are people who want to make them feel welcome and not so isolated in this place where they have to come to seek protection.
Thank you very much, Alison. Okay, should we open it up to questions? Anybody have any questions?
Can I just add one thing?
Yep.
A couple things I just had forgotten to mention. One is we also would love to find resources for family members of those who are in removal proceedings or detention. Often those people are in crisis as well, and it is something that we have come up. I know there are a couple places that have perhaps, I think, some talk therapy groups, but I would love to hear more if people know of specific resources we could provide for family members that are really struggling. And then there's a number of organizations that are trying to do some of that work and then to do that. And then I would do a final, I think a lot of us in this field, we also need help. Okay, so I don't, it would sound a little, and that's part of the barrier, but it's true that I think almost every single immigration lawyer I've talked to in the last 2 years, we're all in a place where it's really hard. So if there are resources or people who are willing to share resources of things that they might be willing to do, especially when it comes to secondary trauma or burnout or however you want to describe it, I think that would be something that's welcome, and it's something that we as attorneys have talked a bit chapter level, but it's something we'd always.
Absolutely. Did you want to say something? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for that, particularly for that last comment, because even as someone who came in late, as I was just hearing what you are up against, I found myself thinking, how are you not being traumatized yourselves, both by the stories that you have to hold for your clients, and then also by this system, which is a very traumatizing system in which you're working. And it's right, it's something similar to what people in our field who work a lot with trauma have to grapple with, as well as people who work in emergency rooms. So I think it's something we should really do some kind of further, put our thinking caps on and see how we can sort of join together around this, so we can kind of keep our strength up and our optimism up as we kind of move forward with the work. So yeah, more to follow. We'll do some thinking about it within the department.
I think it does make us feel less traumatized, though, by seeing people like you who want to help do the work and see our clients have chances for success. So I think that's part of the care for self, is to connect with new communities that are ready to get engaged.
It's also one of the things that I'm concerned about with people who are working down at the shelters. I think the volunteers come and go, the refugees themselves come and go, but when you meet the directors and you meet the people who are selflessly just showing up because they feel like they need to or they have to, and they're not trained professionals, they're maybe just somebody who works at the church, these are community volunteers. And so the secondary trauma, I'm really wanting to talk down there to develop some sustainable programming for the helpers, because they're the people who at the end of the day are the stayers. Everybody else goes and comes. And they're also, by the way, the people at 3 a.m. when the kid's having the nightmare or the woman is weeping, they're the ones who are responding, not the volunteers that show up at 8 a.m. and, not everybody else sleeping in their tents. So I think it's a universal conversation about who's helping and then how do we get help. So.
Hi, I'm Miguel Fiol. I'm not a mental health worker. I'm a neurologist. But I've been involved. Katrina has done a great job with us in our mission work. Prior to that, I did mission work in Puerto Rico, which is my home country. After the hurricane, we had lots of these issues, mental health. I think it's important that there's a wonderful resources in this room, and I think it's important that these resources be focused very clearly. I think there are many sides to this issue of the immigration crisis. I think there's the issue of the outreach, which Katrina is involved with, in our group too. We've done a couple of missions there. And that, I think, the group has to decide where they're going to put their energy, because there's a lots of people, you know, they're working, and I think there's a need for coming together in some focus areas. I think putting focus on the outreach, because there's such a human need out there. Now, those of us that have gone there have come about change, you know, like Katrina's allowed it to the humanism. I think locally, there are a number of areas too, and I think it should be focused. The approach we've taken in our group, we created a Latino group, Frente Acción Latino de Minnesota, and put that group together. And we've been focusing not on the outreach. There is a branch that's the outreach, but we're focusing in the state of Minnesota. And we have had 2 pathways that we're following. And any of you who's interested to belong to our group, it's not only Latinos, but people who feel for the Latino community. There are 2 things we're doing locally. We're creating these teams to go to the communities. We did this in 2017 when the previous ICE crisis, and we went to a community, and we did 2 things in that community. We met with the children of the community. There was in a church, a Catholic church in Richfield, and we see how the children felt about the threat of ICE. We had them do artwork. Dr. Betsy Murray from the university, who's a pediatrician, works with children and trauma, and she helped, and we had them do drawings. And it was a publication made by the Bloomington Health Department, because they were part of this effort. And it was incredible to see the children. And all of us, our hearts dropped when one child said, when they said, "This country is killing me," he said. And the art thing served 2 purposes. One of them to spot children who were having a really hard time dealing with the situation. And surprisingly, we found only a couple of kids. One kid said he wanted to die, and we, in the artwork, we did investigate that through the church, and it was okay. So it served to spot children who are in very severe state emotionally. And the second, we met with the parents. There was about 300 parents, and all the parents said the same thing. We want our children to be safe. And so our hearts have gone out to work with the children and the community. So we're planning to do is go to different communities that have a lot of Latino concentration, like there's Holy Rosary and the Sacred Heart, and there's one in Carver County who has a lot of Latinos that go. And so churches can be a center for reaching the community, because Latinos are very spiritual, very religious oriented. So that would be one way to approach it. So anyway, we're putting together a team to work on the mental health of the community, how they're facing their stresses, and just giving them support. And then there's a section of our work too, which includes the legal branch. And then Michelle Rivero from Minneapolis Immigrant Rights, she's helping us with that. So the idea is to go talk to the community, tell them what your rights are. If your ICE knocks on your door, well, they don't knock, they bang your door down. And that's when the children get really scared. And then another side to support communities with children and deal with that. So I think there's a wonderful resources in this room, but I do beg, and Dee, this is a great initiative, that you focus what you want to do. There's a lot of things to be done. It's a huge problem. It has so many dimensions, and only I learned with the years that they say in my country, el que mucho abarca, poco aprieta. If you try to hold too much, you can't squeeze enough. So I think that this is a wonderful chance to generate some action. So thank you for inviting.
See, in the back.
Hi, my name is Christy, and I'm an LADC, and when I graduate in September, I'll be accumulating hours toward my LPCC. And I just moved back from Southern California, so I saw ICE in action in various different levels. It's very disturbing. I've wanted to help for a really long time. Sorry. I was just there last week and saw more. For those of us that don't speak another language yet, is it possible when we do help to use the manual voice translators, or are you only seeking people that speak another language?
I know at least in Minnesota, we are recruiting volunteer interpreters to work with our mental health professionals. It's still a limited resource, so please let us know, let the advocates know. We have training for interpreters. Anyone who speaks fluently English and a second language, Spanish is a big need, but there's others. We can train, and as long as they're willing to protect client confidentiality and speak a second language, they can work with us. And
yeah, I mean, we do also have a pool of translators and interpreters, but to be quite frank, there's plenty of English speakers that need help as well. I mean, quite a few Somalis have been speaking English since before they came, and so there are people in the community that still do need this sort of work, even if you are only interacting in English. But yes, we are very mindful of the interpretation and translation crisis, and that's something that we welcome any help, and then we will try to find an interpreter or translator on a specific case. Especially, by the way, I know Spanish, there are quite a few volunteers, which is great. On language that I think we've had struggle with are obviously the Mayan languages, and then another one which is Karen. Karen is a language, this is a new refugee community here in Minnesota. There's not a lot of translators that can do it. We've had to pay professional translators to do that work. If there's anyone that can give some voluntary work. But for instance, there were people that were Micronesia, spoke a Micronesian language. There was no translation. I mean, that was just a situation that was not tenable. They had to end up using the consulate for Micronesia to try to translate, which is not ideal, right?
I am Adnan Ahmed. I wanted to ask our panel about social responsibility. What we're seeing right now is that, so in healthcare right now, there's a lot of talk about structural racism, and the immigration issue, as Ms. Cisneros said, is structural racism. There are structures that are perpetuating it, are benefiting from it. So what can we do as individuals, as communities, as organizations? How can we hold the powers and the structures accountable, and how can we separate from structures that perpetuate and benefit from the immigration crisis?
I can say as a white woman that it's time to be anti-racist, and I think that we need to start using the words and naming it in a way and in spaces that I think we need to navigate that conversation in a much more explicit way, first of all. Second of all, I think that it is extremely important. I think oftentimes when we try to center a narrative that is not about us, we oftentimes can center ourselves. And so I think that there is some piece of staying connected to community and to a sense of purpose in which the work continues to be in accountability to the people that we're serving. That's one of the ways that I really try to stay grounded in that. And also to have people who love me and support me and know my commitment to doing work from an anti-racist framework, to be able to call out my implicit and sometimes explicit bias in the work, I think is really critical. And that feels really scary, but I think it's about time that we just are comfortable being uncomfortable. And I think it's also, for me, as somebody who, I carry many identities, as I set up at this table, being really conscious and aware of what those identities are and in what spaces I can leverage the privilege that I have. So right now, the fact that I'm sitting here with the microphone speaking to all of you is a privilege. And I'm aware of that, and I do it in accountability to the people that I really think should be sitting here speaking in this microphone, but will never have the chance to. So I think that that understanding one's own identity and doing one's own work around your identity, and then understanding where that privilege can be leveraged, not only as an ally, but as an accomplice. I think it's time to be an accomplice with people who identify with marginalized communities. I think it's a powerful way to kind of stay stay connected to the work from a point of integrity, and also knowing when you can take risks that other people can't, and finding, I end every single one of my classes to my students saying, go out in the world and be brave. And I have to remember that every time I'm in spaces as well, whether that's in court or with a client or talking to some sort of a system that feels unfair or racist or oppressive. It's knowing in what space do I have an opportunity and a privilege and a responsibility to not stay silent. And so I think it is about being brave and having the stamina as a white woman to stay in the conversation in a way that I feel like we're not socialized or culturalized to do, because quite frankly, we don't have to. We get to check out of these conversations whenever it's convenient, and especially when talking about race. So I would say for me, that's something that, and I'm on the journey, right? I think anybody who ever says that they've gotten there around some of these issues probably just needs to continue doing more work, because it's, you know, it's a lifelong learning process, I think, to undo some of the things that the marinade that we're in. So
I'll just make one quick statement. I think one thing to just be mindful is the people who are most in power in many instances. For instance, none of the detention centers are in the Twin Cities area. There's a reason for that, right? So one of the issues is going to have to be finding ways in which to have conversations with folks that are not the choir. And that's not easy. It's something that I've struggled with. It's not an easy thing, but Sherburne County Sheriff doesn't give a crap about a bunch of quote unquote Twin City liberals on what they think. And so the question is, what can we do to make those people feel the need for transparency and accountability? So I'll leave it at that.
And can I make just a really quick response to that as well? There are a few really specific things you can do. One is divest from private prisons. Private prisons are making so much money off of detention of immigrant communities and people of color. And many of our mutual funds have private prisons as one of their investments. So we have resources at the Advocates on how you can divest if you're interested. Also, stay informed and advocate with your senators and representatives. The senators and representatives really are responsive to what their constituents ask for and become more vocal on the issues when they hear from you. Also, be on advisory boards for organizations that serve communities of color so that we know how to best address the issues that our communities are facing. And we have an LGBT advisory board that some of our clients are on, as well as people in the community, so that we can make sure that we're best meeting the needs of the people that we serve. So those are a few roles, but staying informed, connecting with organizations like the University of Minnesota Clinic, connecting with the advocates so that you can advocate is really important, I think, too.
Thank you, Allison. I am aware of the time, and I know just one second, I know there's another group wanting to come in behind us. We could probably do this for another hour. So I'm going to have one more person make some comments, and then encourage you again, let me have your name and email addresses, because there's another phase coming after this. This is just the beginning. This is the introduction. Or you can just straight email me with your thoughts and your ideas.
Hi, my name's Eileen Weber. I am a nurse attorney. I teach in the U of M nursing school. And I'm in touch with some community clinics that are dealing with this issue, as you can be aware. So I have a quick question for Linus, since you talked about other immigration communities. The public charge rule, do you know, there was talk for a while that if somebody went to a HRSA-funded clinic, like a community clinic, that they would be at risk of being ruled as a public charge and therefore losing their ability to stay in the country. I was wondering if you had an update on that. And then the other thing is, these community clinics that see disproportionate numbers of folks like you are trying to protect and help would like some, the largest one in Minnesota is in St. Paul, and they would like some speakers to come and not only talk to their providers, but also be a place where the surrounding community can come and learn more about their rights. So I was wondering if Alison or Linus or whoever would be willing to do that kind of speaking.
Let me just interject here. Thank you very much for that. Can you folks talk about that sort of offline so we can start to move out of here? I'm worried about the people that need to come in.
As for the public charge rule, there's no good news. It's likely to come in soon. It's likely to be implemented soon. So we can talk more about.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Very much appreciated. Send me your thoughts and reactions, and we'll start phase 2.
Very nice to meet you.
Yeah, it was really nice.
Yeah, and we did talk to the school social work. We did have students there for a while.
When was that? Do you remember?
It was a couple years ago.
Yeah,
we had two, like Ivory was one student that came through, and then we had another student, and then we interviewed a few social work students, but they didn't end up.
You have been disconnected from the meeting.